This week on The Right Side, in BC, Trudeau falling into the ocean gets covered more than real news. Does Kenney actually vow repercussions against BC on pipelines? A license plate dispute highlights being offended versus charter rights, and an update on the illegal border crossers. This is The Right Side, episode 28, recorded Saturday, August 5th, 2017, The Perils of Kayaking. Hello, everybody, and thank you for listening to The Right Side. This week, Patrick and myself are back this week. A little bit smoky over there, but that doesn't take away from the news of the week that we need to cover here. So, we're gonna go through some news and remove bias, sensationalism, and we'll just have to wait and see if this week's stories prove laughable or not. Though I don't know if that's something we're going to be able to step by based on some of the coverage we saw this week on these stories.
Yeah, it's something that we don't normally do. We usually try and keep things really serious here when we're talking about the media because it's important to be professional in how we carry ourselves. But sometimes the media just leaves us no choice, and in by themselves not being professional, sometimes we just have to cover that as well. So I think this first story that I've got here for you all is probably a very good example of that, and I've called it How Trudeau is Covered in the Local BC Media. So for those not aware, Trudeau visited my hometown of Victoria on Friday, and one would think that it would have a lot to do with, the very serious and real crises that we are facing this summer so far in BC. You could count them off on your fingers, such as, the wildfires that have the province in an extended state of emergency for over a month now, the smoke clouds from those wildfires creating an air quality hazard in some places as bad as Beijing, and I'll be honest, that smoke is making me a little bit nasal right now, so we'll do awesome in the show, though, of course. We can also talk about the fentanyl drug overdoses that have claimed almost 2,500 people's lives in BC alone, rising homelessness, skyrocketing house prices, the issue of our energy independence with the Site C Dam project now being stalled, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline maybe being delayed as well. So what did the local media decide to focus on with Trudeau's visit? What hard-hitting issue was profiled in the newspapers that needed fixing? Well, I'll give you a hint, it's none of those that I just listed. It was that while Trudeau was taking a trip to the Gulf Islands National Park, he accidentally slipped into the water while trying to get into a kayak. Seriously. Here's a quote from the front page Times Colonist article. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's visit to a park near Victoria didn't quite follow the script today as he accidentally fell into the water while trying to get into a kayak. A dampened Trudeau joked that he was, in his words, quote, happy the national media was there to capture that.
And just to clarify, as we are recording this at 4 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, the national media is still talking about this on Twitter, not just in BC, but it looks like all across Canada now.
Yeah. So, from the article as well, the Prime Minister's kayak voyage at the Gulf Islands National Park Reserve became even more eventful when a bride and groom sailed up beside his kayak to pose for a selfie with Trudeau. Michelle Gruntzner was wearing her white wedding dress. She said she and her husband, Heiner Gruntzner, were holding their wedding reception on nearby Sydney Spit when they approached the Prime Minister. Trudeau kissed the bride twice. So,
I have heard him do that before. And I'm just saying from my own personal perspective and experience, if someone kissed a bride on wedding's day of someone that I knew or someone that I loved, that would probably raise a bit of an issue.
Mm-hmm. And you might be thinking at this point, well, is there more to this story? What about what he was actually in town for? What about the meeting with the new Premier Horgan? What about the real issues? Well, unfortunately, that was almost the entire article right there. However, another front-page Time Colonist article also noted Trudeau's kayak slip-up in an article entitled Trudeau's Dazzle Crowd in Victoria and PM Delves into Local Issues. So this was, as of right now, still on the front page of timescolumnist.com, and it was front page on the newspaper as well. So from the article, quote, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, lit up the stage and faces of federal Liberal Party supporters at a gathering Friday in Victoria. Introduced by his wife as, quote, your Prime Minister and my hubby, Trudeau recalled one of their past visits to Victoria when the couple paddled kayaks in the inner harbor and later got under each other's skins. Quote, I think we had a fight that day, said Trudeau, grinning. I just never have liked the fact that she is faster in a kayak than me. Trudeau reached out to locals in the audience and touched on Victoria issues directly, including the recent opening of a supervised consumption site for drug users in downtown Victoria. He said it was a part of his government's effort to work with the province to improve the opioid crisis, in which hundreds of people have died of illicit drug overdoses. So you got quite a bit of a shift there, you know? You got a lighthearted story about, fighting over kayaks, and then straight into, where hundreds of people have actually died about a real issue. And it's just amazing that the article took, 4 or 5 paragraphs to get into that issue,
clickbait.
Right?
It's clickbait. That's what BuzzFeed does.
Exactly. He also, according to the article, he also spoke of some of the things he considers his government's successes over the past 2 years. A tax cut for the middle class and a richer Canada child benefit going to more families. It's amazing how Trudeau's phrase of cut taxes on the middle class and raise them for the wealthiest 1% just seems to follow him wherever he goes, right?
Yeah. No.
And apparently he committed his government to seeking reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples and to put a price on carbon pollution to better protect the environment. He did not mention U.S. President Donald Trump and the American move away from the Paris Accord on climate change, but Trudeau specifically committed Canada. Quote, we are standing by the climate change commitment we made in Paris, he said. We can't walk away from the reality of climate change, and we won't walk away from a global plan that has a realistic chance of fighting it. End quote. So the real big problem with the media covering the Trudeau visit from one very, very slanted angle is that it does a disservice to not only Victorians, but everyone who might only get their news from a few sources. And by covering what Trudeau says with such glowing praise and by front paging about the inconsequential accidental dip into the ocean, they stop people from learning about the news that actually impacts all of our lives meaningfully. And by praising Trudeau and focusing on non-eventful issues and reducing him to someone akin to what is featured in the trashy celebrity gossip magazines that you can find in your local grocery stores, the media is actually telling us practically outright that they don't intend on telling us what the real news is.
And here we have the problem that we often see in the nightly news. You said it yourself that we finally get to the serious issue of the drug crisis, but it's not until later in the story. And that's just one issue out of the many that you highlighted. And I think that, fake news has been branded as publishing stories online that might not necessarily be true or might be undersourced. That's one definition of it by people who are in the journalism community who think that their profession is held to high regard. When I wouldn't call any of the reporting that was done this week here in BC high quality on this. So that leads to the new definition of fake news, where you have news media who is basically lowering themselves to, like you said, the tabloids that you see at the grocery store.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fake news isn't just news that is fake. It's also news that is trying to cover up something else that's actually important. And by doing so with, if you forgive the pun, with smoke and mirrors. And it's just amazing how this is what the local media decided to cover on. Not all the problems that we're experiencing and what the government is going to do to help those problems and to, try and solve some of the issues that are going on. But, by talking about the kayak story and by covering it, not just in one article on the front page, but 2 articles on the front page, it just really does a disservice to anyone who actually goes to the news for what it should be, and that's news. And this was not news.
And for anyone who doesn't have time to sort through multiple news websites or parse through these stories and find the actual content of what's happening, they're just wasting their time. So
Hmm.
it's quite disgraceful.
Indeed.
Anyways, all right, moving on over to Alberta now. This week, the headline came in that reads as Jason Kenney vows repercussions against BC over Trans Mountain Pipeline. This was in the Globe and Mail. And, they're obviously using large words here that have huge impact, vows and repercussions. This story almost had a Donald Trump kind of tone to it as to how the media would cover Donald Trump. But let's get into the story here. So, if you are unaware, Jason Kenney is running to lead the United Conservatives in Alberta, and this week he was at a stop and he said that, quote, he would not respond passively to Premier Horgan in BC, his commitment to block the already approved Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. This pipeline expansion is worth $7.4 billion, and that's a huge amount of money for a province and even for Canada in terms of GDP. So it's nothing to sneeze at. Jason Kenney also said that Premier Horgan can't veto a natural resource project that has received regulatory approval by the federal government and the National Energy Board. That's the key point right there. So for those unaware, it is the federal government's responsibility to greenlight natural resource-based projects because, of course, that is the division of power within Canada. As defined in the Constitution, natural resources fall under the federal purview, so they can cross provincial borders with very little red tape, or at least that's the way it's designed.
Yeah, and if they are in the same province and just within the same province, then it's the provincial jurisdiction. But when it comes to a pipeline that goes from Edmonton to, the port in Vancouver, that is definitely something that is up to the federal government to decide.
Yeah. And Kenney clarified, and he said, trade is a two-way street, and that if the government of British Columbia were blocking one of our prime exports, we would find ways to respond in kind. That would be an economic response. So what we're hearing here is the potential to set up some tense negotiations between Alberta and BC. It's within the right of each province to determine what they feel is beneficial to their people and their own economic development, as they should. But with that being said, these decisions should not come at the cost of our neighbors. And, I would be saying the same thing if it was the Alberta government trying to stop something beneficial to BC. I think that's only common sense. So, you read through this article and you should also probably be wondering by that point, what is the actual threat and what would the response look like from both the BC NDP government and a potential UCP government in Alberta in 2019 if Jason Kenney is elected premier. So while campaign promises and slogans are often geared towards extreme language, governing demands modesty. I think everyone knows that you can have grandiose campaign promises, but it will take time to implement them, and you might not get the chance to implement exactly everything that you want. And it's also worth noting that this week we've already seen a potential de-escalation in this issue with the mandate letter that was given to BC Environment Minister George Heyman. In this, it said the government should, quote, employ every tool to defend BC's interests. So that kind of leaves it wide open there as to whether or not BC interests include preventing pipelines. And that'll be something, I think, for the Horgan government to determine. But what we have here is, a rightful defense of the province of Alberta by Jason Kenney for something that the BC NDP campaigned on, and quite heavily, I think. It was a promise to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Site C Dam, and other development projects. And, of course, Trans Mountain is the one that impacts Alberta the most, so that is, of course, what warranted Jason Kenney's response. But I think the media probably took it a little too far. It felt almost as though they were insinuating that there was going to be some kind of trade war or something along the lines of that if Jason Kenney became premier in Alberta. And, we've talked about trade wars here in the past. That's basically when one district prevents a good or service from flowing in and the other one feels right to respond by tariffs or preventing another export from that offending nation or neighbor. So I felt like that's what was being insinuated here in the article, but...
Yeah, it's another clickbaity headline there, like vows repercussions. I mean, that can mean a lot of different things, but probably people would think that, yeah, you're right, it would mean a trade war or something like that, especially
Right.
when it said, economic response uh, and would not respond passively. I'm sorry, but politicians and how they respond to things, most of it is passively when you think about it. They're not really aggressive personally in what they do. I mean, that's just how politics works. You have a lot of give and take and you negotiate.
Yeah.
That's what politics is all about. It's nothing about aggressive, as in he's not going to go up to Premier Horgan and punch him in the face or something like that. He's not going to, there's not going to be troops crossing the border from Alberta or something like that. I mean, it's going to be negotiated upon if Kenny becomes premier in the next near future, while Horgan is still premier. I mean, who knows even if that'll be the case by the time the next Alberta election comes around, we might even have a new government in BC already. So it's hard to know what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah. And one final note on this, it's not up to premiers actually to decide economic sanctions on an order like this, because like we said, natural resources that cross a provincial boundary are the federal government's area. So, and it really didn't highlight that in the story. So once again, doing a disservice and generating some clickbait.
Mm-hmm.
All right. What's next?
Well, here at the right side, we always strive to highlight the bias and sensationalism that is present in the mainstream media, and how that shapes our thinking and perceptions in ways that we probably don't even realize. But sometimes it's also important to highlight a piece of that same mainstream media that actually does cut out the bias and sensationalism that we do here. And with that in mind, I've highlighted a quirky and seemingly ridiculous story that actually has grave implications for our society and state of being. And this is entitled, "Resistance is Not Futile When It Comes to Freedom of Expression." So Christy Blatchford of the National Post wrote an article this past Tuesday that takes a look back at a story that had developed over the past year of a man who had a Star Trek-themed vanity license plate overturned in Manitoba, based on the fact that the phrase used was deemed, quote, offensive. And I remember reading about it at the time, and it kind of struck me as the very definition of frivolous. However, the fact that it happened at all highlights a very worrying trend in today's society, that being offended is now allowed to take the place of freedom of speech, which is, of course, one of the founding principles of our democracy. So from the article, quote, "It is, as the delightful John Carpe says, a full frontal assault on the English language. The plate in question belonged to Nicholas Troller, a Winnipeg resident and Star Trek devotee who in 2015 applied for a plate that read ASIMIL8 in honor of the iconic movie and TV series, paid the $100 fee, and proudly framed it in a border that used two famous Star Trek phrases, quote, 'We are the Borg,' and 'Resistance is futile.' It was crystal clear by how Troller displayed the plate that his context was Star Trek, and his use of assimilate was only in that sense. He displayed it for almost 2 years and renewed it in 2016 with no issues. Then, in April of this year, Troller got a letter from MPI telling him that his plate is considered offensive. And MPI is the Manitoba bureaucracy company that governs license plates and other car insurance related issues. MPI didn't say who found it so offensive, why it was offensive, or if there had been complaints. Troller was ordered to surrender the plate by May 1st, and being offered no course of appeal or recourse, he eventually did.
The Borg are going to be onto them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So in late May, by which time Carpe and the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, he founded in 2010, had found him a lawyer, the lawyer wrote to request the plate be reinstated. More than a month later, a time span that suggests a considered response, MPI told the lawyer it wouldn't reinstate it. So JCCF has now launched a court action seeking a declaration that MPI breached Troller's charter right to freedom of expression under Section 2B in the category of fundamental freedoms. Canadians are guaranteed, quote, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and in order to reinstate the plate. As the JCCF lawyer Jay Cameron notes in his notice of application, not only is the Manitoba government required to uphold these basic charter freedoms, but also as of 2015, it particularly invites Manitobans to express themselves via personalized plates. As the MPI website says, quote, many people prefer to let their personalized license plate speak for them. They can make a statement about a profession, a favorite hobby, status in life, or pride in vehicle ownership. And as Christy Blatchford notes, what is being a Star Trek fan if not a hobby?
Yeah. Just for the record here at the right side, we're both huge Star Trek fans.
Probably Shane more so than I am, but I like it too. So we have to think to ourselves, why was this issue raised? And Christy Blatchford actually makes note of this in her article. It is because of Jack Howen, the Post media reporter who wrote about the subject Monday, that I can say this with some confidence, Blatchford writes. She notes that he sought comment from the Indigenous community and quoted at length a University of Manitoba assistant professor, Nigan Sinclair, who called the free speech argument bogus. From that article, quote, if Indigenous peoples feel triggered by a license plate or a sports logo of the name or of an historical figure on a building, Canadians would be best served to listen to why Indigenous peoples get triggered and to show some care and sensitivity when they express themselves. You can't just say whatever you want to say without any worries of consequence or responsibility.
We're heading into thought police realm now.
Exactly. And, this fascinatingly interesting stance is also explored by Blatchford. And she writes, quote, to this, I'd suggest that if being triggered by a license plate that clearly refers to Star Trek is a genuine concern for Indigenous Canadians, then they are approaching that lucky state where life is sufficiently easy and that you can worry deeply about words and feelings. And that can't be true, given the shameful number of Indigenous citizens who must still boil their water before drinking it, or who live in substandard housing, or whose families continue to suffer the effects of residential schools. And as John Carpe said in a phone interview Tuesday, in this country we live pretty agreeably with certain constraints upon freedom of expression. One can't expect to have a four-letter word on a license plate or to be able to use a plate to denigrate certain protected groups. But as Blatchford notes, assimilate is not that. Yes, the word can have a negative connotation. It can even be offensive, but the proper response to such concerns must be, quote, so what? Because freedom of expression pretty much is about saying whatever you want to say. And I think this is an example of an actually good article that should be read and should be noticed in today's society, because it highlights something that it's kind of stupid when you think about it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
A Star Trek vanity plate getting overturned, but then when you think about it, it actually is pretty serious that people actually suggest that being offended is more important than freedom of speech.
And that's the point where we start to have issues, because there have been many repressive regimes in the world, and there still are repressive regimes in the world who limit freedom of speech. And you ask anyone who lives in any of these countries, the former Soviet Union comes to mind. Today, the internet in China is heavily censored. You ask any of these people who are living in that kind of censorship and government overreach to tell them what is okay and what is not okay, and you ask them if they would like to come to a first world country that has freedom of speech, freedom of expression, they would jump at the chance to do that. So by taking so many stances on this, including this license plate, we are slowly but surely chipping away at our own freedom of speech. And I would also like to point out that the license plate was spelled ASIMIL 8. And for anyone who hangs around on the internet, you'll know that often words are spelled with numbers, and anytime you see a word spelled with numbers, it's not meant to be taken seriously at all. So,
Yeah, and because it's a license plate, there's only a certain number of letters and characters that can be on it. I mean, it's not like it has the second S in there
that's
that
right.
that it has, or the 8 itself that denotes the last part of the word ATE. So I mean, it's a license plate. And how are people getting offended or triggered by this? I mean, especially, I mean, maybe if it was just on its own, I could understand. But I mean, it has the other two phrases around it. It has resistance is futile, and it has we are the Borg. I mean, very clearly it's Star Trek related,
Yeah.
and that just boggles my mind how that could get revoked in the first place.
I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's too bad that they didn't get it back, and I don't know if there'd be any way around this. Maybe some kind of banner in the back of the car if that's not illegal in Manitoba. Kind of like, how they have the baby on board signs that people can get. Maybe something like that. I don't know, but
well, maybe this court case might actually go all the way up to the Supreme Court because it deals with charter freedoms.
That would be really interesting.
We'll have to see what they say about it, because generally the Supreme Court, viciously defends charter freedoms, and this would be a case that I think that they would rule in favor of.
Let's hope so. All right.
Indeed.
So moving on to the firing line, we're picking up an old topic here at the Right Side from the very early days of the Right Side, and we're talking about the illegal asylum crossers that have crossed into Canada. So Montreal's Olympic Stadium has now been set up as a shelter for those what they are calling asylum seekers. 150 cots have been set up inside the stadium, and they are going to be housing these asylum seekers. And last time, just to kind of give an idea of perhaps how denigrating this could be, it was used in Hurricane Katrina inside of stadiums to house people. So let's hope that they are getting proper care here for that, because you can imagine how it would be hot in the summer inside a large building like that, cramped with other people. So let's hope it's going to be all right. But just a bit of an update on the situation as it was. So through the winter and the spring, the number of illegal border crossers into Canada increased dramatically. We heard that the government was handling the situation, but no concrete legal actions were taken. The Canadian government could have overcalled the Safe Third Country Treaty, which states that anyone seeking asylum in Canada or the U.S. must request it in the first country in which they land, which in this case would be the U.S. There's also the issue here that the U.S. is a safe country compared to many others, and the story has largely faded from the media over the summer. This past Wednesday, the stadium began housing those who cross the border illegally. Right now, a good majority of those being housed are Haitians who were displaced by the 2010 earthquake and are afraid they may be deported come 2018 when the deal inside the U.S. that allowed them to stay expires. The article from CTV states, quote, that as many as 60,000 Haitians could be forced out of the U.S. if the program is not extended into 2018. It's worth noting that Canada had a similar exemption, but it expired last year in 2016. This is an issue, and it needs to be dealt with by our national government. Since January, 4,345 people have entered Canada illegally and requested asylum. 77% of these are entering into Quebec, and the alarming part of this is that 781 entered in June and 576 the previous month alone. So as you can see, it is increasing dramatically in the summer. The story then gives coverage to Montreal Mayor Denis Coderre on President Trump's immigration policy. The mayor further complicates the figure by stating that there were 2,500 new arrivals into Quebec in the month of July alone. 2,500. Jean-Pierre Fortin, president of the union representing Canadian Border Services agency Border Guards, said that 500 people crossed illegally on Tuesday. The numbers provided by the RCMP only include up to June, and if the number that the mayor cited is correct, we have a major problem with our immigration system in Canada. So you might be wondering where the Prime Minister is on all this. Well, we already talked in our first segment about where the Prime Minister was this weekend. He was in Victoria, and when he was asked about this by a handful of reporters about the border crossings, he just walked away. No answer was given. So we're in a situation here where if this is not dealt with, we're going to be eroding trust in our immigration system, and people are going to be requesting much tighter immigration control in Canada. When the system is used and the law is applied in Canada, we have a pretty decent immigration system. People can apply if they have skills. They can apply to come here. They get on the fast track if they have family members or if they have marketable skills that the government is looking for. People can come, and I think at last count we're bringing around 250,000 new immigrants into Canada each year, which is a lot. And I think that's a very generous number. And the very fact that we're seeing thousands coming in illegally, ruining the system for everyone else, and no one is talking about it this summer. The government is not doing anything. It's only going to be a matter of time before public trust erodes and something is going to happen to our immigration system.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting about this is that after he didn't say anything in Victoria, there was actually another article that was published just this morning in the Globe and Mail about it, and in it. The headline is Trudeau urges asylum seekers to use proper channels to enter Canada. And you think to yourself, now he's finally saying this. And it's like a year and a half later from when this issue actually started. I mean, this issue started since he was elected first in 2015, and it's just been getting worse and worse and worse. And now finally, when it's actually being mentioned in the media again, he actually comes out and talks about it. And from that article, it says, Mr. Trudeau took pains to reassure Canadians that the country has the resources and capacity to deal with a sudden spike in asylum seekers that have crossed into Quebec in recent weeks. But do we actually have the capabilities for it? Because, there's been a lot of strain on the social services and in Manitoba and in Quebec where they were coming over, and the fact that they're being put up in cots in the Olympic Stadium.
That says a lot.
It really says a lot. And, he finally said, quote, we want migration to Canada to be done in an orderly fashion. There are border checkpoints and border controls that we need to make sure are respected. But before he made that tweet out that said, come to Canada, we'll
welcome.
Take
we're
you
not xenophobic.
Exactly. And now he's finally saying that you actually need to do it in an orderly fashion. And he said that he said something about the migrants needing to understand how the system works and that it will work properly. But they just keep coming over, and they're coming over illegally, and it's what he's doing is not doing anything. And it's a real issue for Canada, and something that needs to be dealt with the more heavy hand, I think.
Yeah, and you see the issue here is that the media, as we discovered this week, they're on the mission to talk about the little slip into the ocean, right? But on the other hand, this could very well become an election issue if there's too many of them and the immigration system breaks in 2019. And, if the Conservatives touch this, the media and the liberal talking heads who populate the media panels and who seem to take marching orders on Twitter and whatnot from the Liberal Party themselves will brand anyone who wants to talk about immigration in that regard or firming up the immigration borders as a racist. And that's the way it's going to go.
Because they already did that with the Cotter payout.
That's right.
They're already trying to sweep that under the carpet, and there were a lot of articles talking about the federal Conservatives and how they were talking about Cotter and how it made it look bad for Canada, and they're forgetting the very real issue that of not the Conservatives making Canada look bad, but Trudeau making Canada look bad for actually authorizing the payment in the first place.
Yeah.
And the fact that the media is trying to just sweep all of these issues under the rug and then, talk about accidentally falling into the ocean. I mean, it's like I said before, it's almost the definition of fake news, because they're not wrong, but they're not, factually incorrect, but they're focusing on things that should not be focused on.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing the problem.
And, just to go back to January 28th, when this first became an issue and when the U.S. travel ban came down, the first version of it, Trudeau put out a tweet that said, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Welcome to Canada."
Mm-hmm.
And that was the tweet that got everything started.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we said this week. It's baffling about the media coverage on all of these stories, and something has to be done before the immigration system becomes unusable, or we get a hardline candidate like Donald Trump on immigration. So.
And that's really why we exist here, is we want to highlight all of these issues that the media, portrays, and to highlight the bias and sensationalism that they use in not only their headlines, but in the actual stories themselves, and how they're using the news to shape public opinion.
Yeah. And lots of people don't realize that, it just feels as though the public opinion is shaped by the news media, but there is the whole other side of the story that isn't coming out. So it's doing a disservice to everyone, really. And that's the core reason why we're here. So, All right. What do you got for word of the week?
All right. So the word of the week comes from the third story that we did there, and that is the word offensive. And, trying to keep in the same general lighthearted tone that we did with the article, rather than taking this definition from a regular dictionary, I went to the Urban Dictionary, which sometimes has bad ones, but this one is actually very good, and I think it's actually very much on point with how offensive actually is. And it's being described as, quote, "a highly subjective interpretation of something real, imagined, or interpreted as being demeaning. Very often the use of complaint to attack someone, while paradoxically assuming both authority and victimhood. And it's also the use of a complaint as a socio-political weapon or vehicle to often unmerited benefit, privilege, or compensation." And I think that really sums up being offended by something. It's trying to take a position of authority, but also be a victim at the same time.
Exactly.
And it's using that complaint. It's using the word offended as a weapon to gain from it, just as we saw in the story from Manitoba, where they actually gained in stopping that license plate, which was, as from the definition, unmerited. And the example here is, "Their being offended is deeply and inherently offensive to me. I demand you recognize my victimhood and give me what I want now."
Oh, that's a great quote using the word right there. All right. Well, hopefully we didn't offend anyone with this week's coverage. And if we did, well, that sometimes is the nature of cutting through bias and sensationalism of news and real facts of what's going on. So I don't believe there's anything.
Thankfully, we live in a country that allows us the freedom of speech to be able to talk about it as well.
Very true. Very true. Well, I don't think there's anything else for us this week. If you want full show notes, that's at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on Twitter and Facebook at rightsideca. And if you want to subscribe on iTunes, rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. Thank you for sharing your time with us, everyone, and we'll be back next week.